sort of like embodied conversation that they got to experience, and then like hear how they actually interacted with it, hear how they look through the lens that you created, and have a conversation about it. And often to me, it like those are kind of the most exciting moments. I think, I think listening to somebody, feedback can look like somebody who's like an incredible speedrunner of your game explaining to you how they figured out all of their strategies and figured out some weird derivative strategy trick to like hack their way through a thing that you painstakingly set up, right? That's a version of feedback. That, feedback is not always, here, I'm handing you a thing and you just tell me if you like it or don't like it and what those parts are.
Okay. Going back to that, what you guys were saying about working kind of, or taking it across your whole creative practice in multiple games, I think sort of like Derek was saying, there is, I think, an element here that we all have of privilege, having worked on multiple games and being able to keep working on games. But my understanding, and I remember this from a talk that Bennett Foddy gave, maybe it was the talk he did with Uzak, but that like most devs, like 95% of devs will only ever ship one game. So given that, how do you internalize it that way? Just to ask that question back, it's like if you don't necessarily assume you're going to have like this robust career of multiple games and you feel like you're putting a lot of your eggs in one basket by necessity, how do you then think about your practice? Or is it all the same? Like, is that still relevant to focus on the practice more than the outcome of one individual game?
I think if you're only shipping one game, it's very hard to do something that's too far out of the norm. Like, I think you have to sort of hew to a set of expectations that people are going to have, because otherwise there's just no way to like calibrate. And then I think there is a really different kind of feedback, because a lot of the stuff you're looking for is like, both in terms of your research and in terms of looking at what people are experiencing, then you're working within a context and like a history, and you can look at games and see like, well, how do the jumps feel across all the games of the genre? What are the kinds of things that people are doing, and can I subvert that stuff? Like, I think Hollow Knight did a really good job with this. Like, that's a game that was super great, totally unique, but like extremely closely hewn to like a genre, and managed to like use a lot of the tropes and expectations of that stuff.
Well, I only shipped one game. Let's be honest.
You worked on other games, though.
I worked on
I
worked on a bunch, but I've shipped, but I've given feedback on a bunch and collaborated. But like, for the most part, like, there was one, right? And in that case, all I can say is that it was super important for us to get feedback, right? Because we had no clue. Especially because we weren't doing that thing that you just said, Zach. We were not trying to recreate an existing genre, and no one knew how to control it. And we had to let a lot of new people play it, and it was painful. But we wanted to will it into existence, and we did. And by the time we were finished,
this game is Osmos, by the way, for folks who are new to the podcast.
By the time we were finished with that game, and we wanted to put it out in the world, we were just worried that no one would look at it. Right? We were like starved for feedback at that point. Like, we just and that was the kind of feedback that you were also just describing, Zach, which was the kind where we wanted to have a conversation. The whole idea of putting out the first game, for us at least, and I think this goes for a lot. Well, I don't know if it's still the case, but definitely back then for most indie developers I met, was I want to be part of this conversation, and I want to be in this conversation and in this area, and that's why we're putting this into the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. Going back to when you shipped Splunky Classic, Derek, or just Splunky, as it was called back then, we had a question from our listener, Elan Rubin, who said, I'm wondering about how you responded to feedback on Splunky Classic, especially the difficulty, because the series wasn't established yet. How did you react to critiques, and overall, how much should feedback influence your long-term vision for a game? So maybe before you had...
Yeah, I mean, I think with Spelunky Classic, that's really where it got established that, oh, it's going to be this certain way, and I'm going to be kind of protective of my vision for it. And I think it was easier because it was a freeware game, right? And so I made it for myself, and, to put it on TigSource and have people play it, of course. But I think just it being freeware made it seem very easy to say, well, no, it's, it's meant to be this difficult,
I guess also the difficulty being like you're saying, like you said earlier, you don't necessarily want people to love or hate it. You just want to make them feel something. And I think the thing people probably loved and hated about it from the start was the difficulty, right? Like I'm sure you got as much love as you did complaints about it. That's what people like locked into.
Yeah, and also I just noticed that as I kept improving the game in the sense of fixing bugs, making things a little more intuitive, things that were meant to be more intuitive, I made more intuitive. I noticed that people just found the game to be easier. At least they didn't find as much problem with the difficulties. So, that's something that I talk about in this feedback article, but a lot of the feedback that you get from players, they don't necessarily know exactly what's causing them to feel a certain way. They have an idea that it's this one thing, but it could be another thing. So, someone might say, oh, the game it's too difficult. There are, too many bats in this stage or something like that. And really the problem is, well, I didn't make the controls smooth enough for them so that like every time they try to whip a bat, they end up getting hit. Like the hitbox is bigger than it should be or something like that, right? And so, yeah, as I kind of made little adjustments like that, I noticed that the complaints, were less and less. I mean, there was this one poster in particular who was like he was getting mad about the game, but he just couldn't stop playing it because he liked the concept so much.
Was his name Colin Northway?
I wish, yeah, that would have made a good story, but. No, I don't remember who it was. I don't think it's anybody that I know personally. But they would post kind of the same thing. Like it's too hard. It's too hard. Make it easier, and then I'd fix bugs and put out like a new version of the game. And then, they would. It was funny because they kind of keep me updated on the progress they're making in the game, and they're just like making steady progress and getting further and further and further and further, while still kind of sticking to this idea that the game is still too hard. But for me, I took them saying that, even though they're complaining about it, the fact that they were making progress steadily, I felt like, that was an indication that I was doing something right and that I was fixing the right things and not just taking what, he or what they said that the solution should be and just implementing that.
The reason that I joked about Colin was actually because I was thinking about him while you were saying that, because us along with Colin and Sarah were playing Spunky 2 for the podcast kind of right before it launched, and I remember Colin sort of like giving you some strong opinions about things like, oh, this thing is weird or not working right or whatever, and I feel like you were like, all right, cool, that's a bug or a thing I need to fix, and then other stuff you were just like, chill, it'll make sense over time or in the grand scheme of things. I feel like that's how I've seen you like internalize stuff.
Well, I think one thing with me is that when someone has like a strong reaction, I have, whether it's positive or negative, I have a positive like reaction to that myself. So
yeah,
I think, yeah, when somebody is like, oh, I really don't like this part of the game, I actually, it kind of puts a smile on my face just because like they had a strong reaction, and I just loved that. I loved that. Yeah. And then, that's at least my initial impression. But, after, if I get enough of feedback that, something just really is unpleasant, then I think it's time to fix it, right? Or do something about it.
Well, to go back to your post, so first off, you have a nice intro. You kind of talk about this concept. You say that feedback is for improving the game, helping you view the game from different perspectives, motivation, and rescoping, which we could talk about any of those. But also the next section you have, which we were sort of talking just now about, maybe feedback from peers that like Andy was looking for around the time of launch of Osmos, maybe, or feedback from other players, like you're talking about, Derek. You talk about this concept of sympathetic and unsympathetic feedback, which was really nice to like see you spelled it out really well, and you talk about how sympathetic feedback is from friends and family or other devs or taking your game to events. And unsympathetic, feedback is from maybe people who are like leaving comments on an article about the game or a trailer. And you say there, one of the main differences between the two types of feedback is that sympathetic feedback assumes your game will be a success at some baseline level. It merely seeks to help you improve on that success. So while it's motivating and may offer useful criticism, it's generally not the best indicator of how well your game will eventually do sales-wise. In other words, sympathetic feedback won't really tell you if it thinks your game is going to be too niche to sustain a living.
Yeah, that was kind of the main thing for me. Is just, I mean, and I think about when I give feedback myself. If like a friend brings a game to me or something like that, and I think I'm already looking at, okay, this is a cool thing that my friend made. How do I help them make it better? But I'm not thinking like, oh, this is just not gonna work out, right? Like that's not something that I would think. It's not something that I would feel comfortable telling a friend. And for me personally, I don't know, even if it's not necessarily like a genre of game or something that I like, I would always think, oh, well, but there's probably an audience for it that's just not me or something like that, right? I would think about my own taste versus other people's taste. And the other thing is,